Okay. Torah begins by Daber Hashem Moshe Lemor. Daber el bnei Yisrael Lemor. Isha kisas ria. A woman who conceives. V'yolda zocher. And she gives birth to a male. V'toma shivas yomim. As a result of the birth, whether there's blood or no blood, she's contaminated for 7 days. Kimei nidas dvosis hitmo. As the days of a menstruant when she flows, who has a flow, she has the same type of contamination. We're speaking here, even if there's no blood, at the time of the birth, even if there's no blood, she becomes contaminated. The act of birth itself causes her to be contaminated. And that level of contamination is identical to a woman as a menstruant. We're going to read in a moment. The Torah tells us that beyond 7, even if she continues to bleed, if it's a male for 33 days, although it's menstrual blood, it's coming from the uterus, she's not contaminated. If it's a female, she's contaminated for 2 weeks as a result of the birth. And there, although she has the flow for 66 days, twice as long, she's not contaminated. She goes to the mikveh after 7 days or after 14 days, and she's permitted to her husband. That's the Torah law, the Torah law. And the Gemara tells us that although the blood is coming from the same source as a woman who menstruates, the Torah says in regard to the birth, that since the reason why the uterus is giving its blood is only because of the birth, therefore she's not classified as a menstruant, and she's not contaminated beyond the 7-day period or the 14-day period. It's exeris hakosuf. So it's not the actual blood that contaminates, but it's, the Torah says, what is the cause of that flow? Is it birth or is it menstruation? The Torah tells us the 3 classifications of mitzros. There's mishpatim. What are mishpatim? Mishpatim means rational laws. For instance, a person should not steal, should not damage a fellow's property. That's referred to as mishpatim. Ownership rights, these are rational laws. Then we have laws which are called edus. The reason why we observe them and we keep them, it's a testament. For instance, Shabbos. Shabbos is a testament to the world that God's the creator. That's edus. Tefillin is called os, it's an edus. We carry the sign of God upon us. Milah, circumcision, is os bris. It's a sign of the covenant that we have this relationship with Hashem. But then we have chukim. We have statutes which you cannot relate to them on a rational level. The reason why we observe them and we're bound to them is because it's God's decree. It's God's decree. Although there is no rational approach to it, nevertheless, you must keep it. That's a chok, that's a statute. So we have mishpatim, edus, and chukim. And Rashi cites many times the Chazal, the ultimate chok. What was the ultimate statute? The Parah Aduma. Zos chukas haTorah. What's the ultimate chok, statute of the Torah? The Parah Aduma, which even Shlomo Melech, the wisest man who ever lived, which he was able to come upon through his wisdom, the understanding and the rationale and the inner workings of a statute. However, regarding the Parah Aduma, he said, Rechokim mimeni. Even that's beyond my grasp. Why? Because it's Metayrus atmeim, and it's Metamei esatorim. It contaminates, it purifies those who are contaminated. The person who comes in contact with the dead, nothing could relieve him of that contamination, only the sprinkling of the Parah Aduma. But yet, the one who actually carries that water with the ash together becomes contaminated. It seems to be contradictory. If it has the ability to bring about the ultimate level of purification, why does it contaminate? It's an inner contradiction. Zos chukas haTorah. That's the ultimate statute. And as I said, and even Shlomo Melech says, that's the only statute he was not able to fathom. All the others he could. Basar b'cholov, you cook milk and meat, what's the halacha? You're not permitted, you're not permitted to eat it, meat and milk, you're not even benefit from it. What about if you marinate meat in milk and it's fully absorbed in the meat? You're permitted to eat it. It's only if you cook it together. It's only absorbed through the cooking process. But although it permeates the meat, and every fiber of that meat is absorbed with milk, there's no prohibition on it. It's rabbinical. It's purely rabbinical. On Torah level, you permit it. So the Midrash always says that the nations of the world and Satan, they always come and they aggrieve us regarding chukim. Why? They say it doesn't make sense. Why doesn't it make sense? Because if something in its essence is forbidden, meaning it's contrary and detrimental to spirituality, why in a similar context is it permitted? For instance, this is the Midrash. A combination of wool and linen, which is called shatnez, tzemer upishtam yachtov, a Jew is not permitted to wear. A combination of wool and linen. Every moment you wear this combination, you're in violation of a negative commandment. It says lo silba shatnez. You're not permitted to wear shatnez, which is the combination of wool and linen. Yet, if you have a woolen, four-cornered garment made of wool, and you tie strings which qualify as tzitzis in those corners, you're permitted to wear that four-cornered garment, although by tying the linen tzitzis, the strings are made of linen. The garment is made of linen, and the strings are made of wool. So by tying those woolen strings into those corners, attaching them, what have you created? You've created an entity of a combination of wool and linen. Yet the halacha is you're permitted what? You're permitted to wear it. It's a mitzvah. And from there we learn the concept of asay dochalos asay, that if there is a contradiction and there's an irresolvable situation where you have a positive commandment and a negative commandment, the positive commandment supersedes the negative commandment. So they say, doesn't make sense. If in fact, innately, the combination of wool and linen is detrimental to your spirituality, why, if you put these strings on, which is called mitzvah, why does that permitted? But factually, you're still wearing a combination of wool and linen. So, and Satan also whispers in our ear. It doesn't make sense. If this is permitted, even if it's not in that context, it should be permitted. Another example. If a woman who's a menstruant, if a person is involved with her, it carries a very serious liability. If she touches something, she contaminates. It's a source of contamination. That means it's something that menstrual blood generates the most extreme level of spiritual contamination and brings about a very extreme level of liability. Yet, when a woman gives birth, after the 7-day period, although she continues to have the flow coming from the same source for 33 days, if it's a male, the husband's permitted to the woman. The woman doesn't contaminate. And if it's a female, 66 days. As they say, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And it gives multiple examples similar to this. All the examples the Midrash gives are situations where you have another example. The halacha is that a man is not permitted to marry the wife of his brother. It's considered an incestuous relationship. If a man is married to a woman, he divorces her. And now the brother wants to marry his brother's divorce, he's not permitted. If he marries her, it's an incestuous relationship, carries the liability of kores, and the child is illegitimate. If a man dies and he has children, and the surviving brother wants to marry the widow of his brother who had died, it's not permitted. Incestuous relationship. But the halacha is, if the brother should die childless and he leaves over a widow, it is a mitzvah to perform levirate marriage, to marry that woman, to perpetuate the name of that deceased brother. But if having relations with that woman is so extreme that she's not marriageable. Even if you marry her, she's not a married woman because it's an incestuous relationship and the child's illegitimate. That's how negative it is within the spiritual realm. Why, if there's no children, how's it a mitzvah? It's a contradiction. It doesn't make any sense. These are the examples given in the Midrash. So one of them is what we're speaking about now. A woman gives birth, although the blood is menstrual blood, it's coming from the uterus, so on and so forth. Normally, it's not. Is it permitted? Not permitted. As they say, it doesn't add up. What's the answer? It's a chok. It's God's mandate. It's His statute. And although we don't understand these inner workings, but it's enough that we're put on the grandstand to be criticized. It doesn't make sense. And the evil inclination whispers in our ears, it doesn't make sense. If this is permitted, that should be permitted. And unless you go and you accept it and you embrace God's will, and you let this question continuously repeat itself in your mind, eventually, ultimately, it will undermine your ability to do the right thing. That's the Midrash. There's a Sefarno says in one location, what is a chok? A chok, it demonstrates one's reverence and one's avos Hashem. If you do something, although you don't understand why you do it, what does that say? I have full trust in God. Although I don't understand it, I accept it. But we find other chukim, for instance, dietary laws. A chukim, species. We spoke last week. If an animal chews its cud and has split hooves, it's a kosher species. If not, not. The question is why? It's a chok. Dietary laws are a chok. It's a statute. But how do you do it if you don't understand it? The answer is we don't have to understand it. If you understand who God is, and if God gave that law, although you don't understand, if it's God's mandate, evidently He's giving it for a reason. So although there are many things we don't understand, we embrace it because we have full trust in God that if that is His will, it's now a benefit to follow His will. That's what observing a chok, that's what it demonstrates. It demonstrates reverence for Hashem and avos Hashem. Yiras Hashem and avos Hashem, that's what it demonstrates. The others, they say, it really makes sense. And because it makes sense, therefore, I do it. Many years ago, people, they would keep dietary laws, although other laws they didn't keep. Why? Because they said the reason why we keep dietary laws is because it's a question of health. I'm going back in the 40s and the 50s. People observed dietary laws, although they didn't observe many other laws, because they felt it makes sense, it's a health issue. So one time a Jew would not eat pork because there was a question that a person can get trichinosis if you eat pork, because the way it was cured, it wasn't cured properly, and you can contract a serious bacteria, and you could die from it. Therefore, they would not eat it. But now that they've come up with a way to cure it in a way where it's safe, people do. So if you begin, the reason why is for the rational reason that it's literally you're putting your life in jeopardy, that's why not. So once that issue is no longer an issue, a person will go and he'll cross that line. Because the only reason why initially they said, because it makes sense. Dietary laws, because at one time where vessels were not glazed properly, and you would have the clay vessel would absorb the dairy and the meat, and ultimately it would create this putrid residue of whatever food is, that the combination would breed disease. And therefore, that's the reason why Jews keep separate dishes for milk and meat. That's what they used to say. But today that we have glazed dishes, and therefore the vessel or the dish doesn't absorb as it was once, said you want the ones doesn't have to be concerned because there's no residue of whatever it is. But that has nothing to do with it. There's nothing to do with it. Because the combination is unhealthy. It is unhealthy, spiritually speaking. It doesn't do well to our spirituality because God said so. So now, the first Rashi over here, Rashi cites Reb Simloi. Omer Reb Simloi. Kishem Shirotzo Shel Odom Acha Kol Bein B'Chayvo F'Masa Bereshis. As we find that the formation of man, the creation of man, followed the formation of the domesticated, undomesticated, and bird in the order of creation. Similarly, the laws pertaining to the human being follow the laws which pertain to the animal, the unintelligible species. Last week in Parsha Shmini, we read about what determines whether a species is a kosher species or a non-kosher species. If it's an animal, it has to chew its cud and have split hooves. If it's a bird, the Torah goes and explains which species yes, which species not. And then we speak about the laws which pertain to the human being. Okay? However, if you look in the Midrash continues. It cites a pasuk in Tehillim. It says, Ocho v'kerem tzartoni. We find it says, Ruach Elokim rachef al pnei hamoyim. In the beginning of creation, the Spirit of God was hovering over the water. That's referring to what? To Hashem, to God. So it says, if in fact, so the concept of the human being being created is all determined by what? It wasn't a random act. The human being, his essence is his spirituality, and he's not just an intellectual animal, but rather he's a spiritual creature created by God to reflect God's characteristics, to make choices, that has control in many aspects of his life. That's why that was the objective of creation. So if that is the objective, so why was the world created? The world was created to be the location, the setting for man to make choices. So therefore, logically, why was man held over for the end? He was held over for the end because everything has to be in place before he's put into this setting called existence to be ready to make choices on that playing field. But if he would have been created first, before all the species, before the world was created, what's his value? He has no value because he's not in a context or a setting where he's able to exercise his choice. Therefore, Hashem kept him over till the end of creation. Only once everything was in place, only then does he bring him on the scene. Now you're ready to go into the function mode to be able to make choices. What I'm telling you right now is Rabbeinu Bachya. And that only indicates that man is the center of the universe. And that's why he was held over to be created at the end. But that's only if you believe that the human being was created as a human being. But if the human being only came about as a result of evolution, he evolved. And therefore, there's no rhyme or reason for the human being. The human being evolved into an intellectual being. So what does the Torah say? What's Torah referring to? He says, in Cain, Yitush Kodmoch. If that's the case, the flea was created before you. I became into being before you. So where do you emanate from? You emanate from the flea. You emanate from the monkey, or wherever you come from. You know, we used to tell over a story. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, he was flying on an airplane. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky passed away. He was 95 years old. And he was flying to Israel. He must have been about 90, because he had grandchildren, great-grandchildren living in Israel. And a couple who was married flew with him to accompany him to Israel. And during the flight, then it was about a 12-hour flight from the United States to Israel, his grandchildren were continuously engaged with him, speaking to him, discussing things with him. So there was another Jew on the flight. He says to the rabbi, he says, there's something very interesting. Today we live in an era of what's called the generation gap, that there's no communication between children and parents, or grandchildren and grandparents. It's like we're different worlds apart. And yet I see continuously, your grandchildren are engaged with you continuously, hearing and wanting to understand what you have to say. Why? Why you don't experience this problem, and we do experience the problem. So he said to the person, he says, I want to explain you something. He says, we believe that man was created by God. And we became a people at Sinai. The farther we distance ourselves from Sinai, the less we become. So therefore, our children are taught and understand, because of that belief, they want to consult with the generation that's closer to Sinai, because that's more special. But if you believe that you come from the ape, from the monkey, the further you distance yourself from the monkey, the more advanced you are. I mean, when you go to the Bronx Zoo, are you gonna put your head to the thing and you want to say, by the way, what brand cigarette do you smoke? Marlboro or Pall Mall or whatever the brand is, or Chesterfield? I'm not mentioning brands that don't exist any longer, right? You're not going to consult with the monkey. Therefore, there's a generation gap.
It would probably be Camel, Rabbi.
Camel, okay. Because Alan's person told him you have to walk a mile for a camel. It's good for exercise. It's a health issue. No, it'll offset the negative effect of smoking. It's okay. Just walk a mile for a camel.
No, because you're at the zoo. That's why.
Got it. Not a problem. Usually you have the Milsa B'Dichusa before you start the Dvar Torah. Alan always inserts it right towards the end. It's okay. Okay. But again, that's it. If a person maximizes on the value, on the opportunity of life, they say, you preceded existence. That means you value your spirituality. It was a God you created for a purpose. But if a person doesn't, so how does he live? He lives his life like an intellectual animal. They say, you came after the flea. The flea preceded you. You evolved from the flea. It's like evolving from the monkey. I'd once asked the question, the most three humble people, who were the most three humble people who ever lived? Moshe, Avram, and David HaMelech. Moshe was the most humble person, because Moshe said, Nachnu mo. What are we? We're nothing. Avram Avinu had said, Anochi Ofav Efer. I am dust, I am ash. So as little value as ash or dust has, it's still more than nothing. David HaMelech says in Tehillim, Anochi Tolev Eloish. I'm a worm, I'm not a person. Could you imagine David HaMelech? David HaMelech, the greatest king who ever lived. David HaMelech Chai V'Kayim, he says, I'm a worm, I'm not a person. So a worm, as measly as it may be, creature, but factually, it's a living entity. So the worm is more than ash and dust and ash are more than nothing. These are the three most humble people who ever lived. So I asked the question, Chazal are telling here that if you believe that there's a creator and there's a purpose in creation, we say your value has the greatest value. Everything was created because of you. If not, we say Yitush Kadmach. The flea preceded you. The flea is less than the worm. So David should have said, Anochi Yitush v'lo ish. Why do you say Tolei v'lo ish? I'm a worm and not a person. Why do you choose the worm rather than the flea? It's a question that bothered me. So what I understood it meant, because if you take a look, there's a Medrash, we call the Medrash, there's a pasuk where Hashem, the Navi, says that Yaakov Vinu is called Tolas Yaakov. Tolas Yaakov. Yaakov is similar to the worm. How's Yaakov similar to the worm? So the Medrash says, Esav is Hayidayim Esav. His power lies in his brute physicality. That's Esav. Where does Yaakov's power lie in? In his power of speech. Hakol Kol Yaakov. That's Tefillah and that's Torah. That's a Kol Kol Yaakov. Now, the cedar tree is the most majestic tree. Now, there's a worm could topple a cedar tree. How does a worm topple a cedar tree? That with its mouth, although the worm is a pliable little creature, which has no strength, but with its mouth, it's able to bore into the base of the cedar tree and ultimately topple the cedar tree. So the power of the worm lies in its mouth. This is the Midrash. That's what Yaakov is called Tolas Yaakov. Yaakov, the worm of Yaakov. Because the power of Yaakov lies in his mouth as the worm, although it's this pliable, little measly creature, nevertheless it has the power to topple the cedar tree. So what David is saying, all my accomplishments, I attribute everything I have to what? It has nothing to do with me. It's my koach tefillah. It's the power of my tefillah, of my supplication, the power of my Torah. That's what it's all about. So when he's saying the worm, not because it's a measly creature. It would be a measly creature, he'd say, I'm a flea, I'm not a person. But he says, no, I'm a worm, I'm not a person. Person's an orator. He's a speaker. He's a great intellectual. He prides himself in who he is. David says, no, I pride myself. What am I? I am nothing. All my accomplishments I attribute to the power of speech that I'm able to speak to Hashem, and Hashem responds. That means he doesn't attribute any of his levels of accomplishment to himself whatsoever, but rather everything is Hashem. That's the ultimate expression of humility. Not to take credit for anything, but rather because you endowed me with the power of speech, that power I utilize it only to supplicate you and to invest it in Torah study.
And the flea means what?
The flea here is talking about, if you don't believe in spirituality, in what we're speaking about here, the laws which pertain to the human being, which is the spiritual human being, that's what we're speaking about here. A woman gives birth, she's contaminated, so on and so forth. Last week we spoke about kosher species, non-kosher species. So we say that just as creation, all creation preceded man, so the human being should be put in a setting to immediately function and exercise his power of choice, which indicates that he is the center of the universe. Identically, the laws are only mentioned afterwards, after the laws which pertain to the animal. But if you don't believe that, if you believe there's no such thing as laws pertaining to the person, but rather the person is only an advanced intellectual animal. So if that's the case, something, you're the last man to show up at the stage. The flea preceded you. Because there we're talking about a person who only believes that the essence of existence it's all random, it's all physicality. So if that's the case, you think you're so special, the flea preceded you. It's like you emanate from the flea. It's like emanating from the monkey.
Rabbi, clearly the flea did precede, but it's